Ladies and gentlemen, how are you doing today? I am Eric Wells, the Education Coordinator for the NextGen Genealogy Network. My company is Legacy Left Right, and just like you, I love genealogy. Well, here at this Faces of NextGen Live video series, we get to interview genealogists from all over the place and kind of talk about what gets them interested and what some of the challenges are that they find and some of the exciting stuff that they get to that they've discovered or are excited about every time they get to work on genealogy. Well, today I am really lucky enough to talk to one of my friends, Jane Rollins. Jane, how are you doing today?
I'm just fine, Eric.
I'm really excited to talk to you. You and I, we met just this year at the San Diego Jamboree Conference.
It's in Burbank, but yes, that's where we met over lunch.
I said San Diego. Yes, in Burbank, right across from the airport. You run you've got your blog. You're known as the Sherlock Holmes.
That's correct. Sherlock Holmes Genealogy.
And tell us a little bit about, like, where did you get that name?
Well, I was introduced to Sherlock Holmes, the detective, when I was 8 years old. My father gave me a complete version of the Sherlock Holmes short stories, and I just fell in love with them. And interestingly enough, before I became a genealogist, I went to a meeting of a local charity group, and the speaker was talking about how genealogy was like solving a mystery like Sherlock Holmes. And so when I formed my business 5 years ago, that was the first thing that came to mind. So I made a little word twist and made it Combs, like teasing, and I have a tagline of teasing out the truth of your family history, and that became my logo. Sherlock comes with a deerstalker cap and a teasing comb.
I love it. I love the wordplay on it, Sherlock Holmes. And how long have you been doing genealogy?
Well, I actually started when I was a NextGener. I was probably 37 at the time when I interviewed my one remaining grandmother who was in her 90s, and I got hooked.
Yeah? So in your 30s, you've been doing it since your 30s?
Yes. And I'm 65 now, so it's been a while.
I imagine you've dug through your family tree and have found all sorts of very interesting characters. Who would be the one ancestor that you would want to meet?
I think I would most like to meet my great grandmother. Her excuse me, her name was Gittel Klebanski. She had a wandering husband, and she divorced him back in 1905. There weren't a lot of women that did that.
Oh, wow.
back in the Russian Empire.
Oh, it was in the Russian Empire.
In the Russian Empire. And
wow.
She subsequently remarried a man who wanted to go pioneer in what is the country of Israel today. And so in her 60s, she pulled up stakes with this new husband and moved to what was then Palestine and worked on a kibbutz growing oranges. She lived to be 94. She died just a few months after I was born, and I never got a chance to meet her. So she's the person I would most like to meet.
She sounds pretty bold and brave, just kind of making her own path in life.
Yeah, girl power, right?
So she had her own property in Israel or Palestine?
No, they lived on a kibbutz, so it was communally owned.
Oh, okay. Do you know if it still exists?
I do not.
Yeah, that's pretty touchy territory nowadays. But
yes, things are fraught. Let's just summarize it that way.
Yeah. So you talked about Russia. Do you have some deep Russian roots? And it almost sounds like you've got some deep Jewish roots as well.
That's correct. All four of my grandparents were born in what was then the Russian Empire. 3 out of 4 of them emigrated to the United States while it was still the Russian Empire. My mother's mother and her family came after the Russian Revolution when the country was the Soviet Union.
Um, so they immigrated around the 1930s, or?
No, several of my people came in the late 19th century, around the 1890s. Then some came in the early 1910s. And then a final batch came in 1922.
Got it. What do you think? I've got a list of questions here, but I actually am kind of interested about Russian, researching your Russian ancestors. Has that been fairly difficult to do?
Well, once you go across the pond, it's a mixed bag. It turns out I speak, read, and translate Russian, so I have less difficulty than other people might. I have found evidence of my family in business and local residence directories, but the towns where they came from, the vital records for the Jewish community, for the most part, either don't survive or they're in obscure archives where access to foreigners has been limited until fairly recently. So I am waiting with bated breath for digitized versions of my maternal grandmother's birth registers to show up. I know they exist because I hired a researcher 15 years ago. He claimed to have seen them, but the Xerox machine wasn't working that day, or there was no electricity, or for some reason I got extracts but no actual images. But I'm told that these images will become available at a website called jewishgen.org in the very near future, and I'm excited to finally see my grandmother's birth record. She supposedly, everybody in the family had to lie about their age when they emigrated, because my great grandmother on that side was too old, and people were likely to be deported back to their home country if they couldn't work, and the immigration authorities would consider them likely to become a public charge, basically to end up on welfare because of their age. And my great grandmother lived to be either 97 or 108. So she clearly was no such thing, but I think that she felt it was necessary to do so. So finding out when Grandma Tanya was actually born will be very exciting.
Yeah, that's our ancestors. They seem to every now and then lie about their ages for whatever reason, whether it's to be older to get into the military, or be younger, like you were saying, to qualify for certain benefits, whether it's immigration or what have you. That's something that's kind of exciting and challenging as genealogists that we have to keep take account of when we're doing our research.
Absolutely. And because of the lack of vital records and census records, they didn't have the equivalent of our every 10-year census. The Russian Empire did do censuses, but at very bizarre intervals. And again, because Eastern Europe suffered through the Russian Revolution, the famine, the Jewish community endured pogroms, which are massacres, just because they were Jewish, and then the famine in 1919 through 1921, and then World War II. So it's amazing that anything in the archives survives at all. And some of my Jewish clients have been lucky and found documents that are pertinent to their genealogy. But because there have been so few in my family, I just feel that I'm very lucky to have started when I did. I did interviews with cassette tapes, which tells you how long ago this was, with about a dozen and a half family members.
Oh, wow.
I only had the one grandmother still alive, but several of the siblings were still alive. And I interviewed my own parents and their siblings, and even my sister Lori, who was far more likely to become a genealogist than I was, but didn't. And I
Hello.
I'm sorry about that. I meant to unplug my phone. Let me do that unobtrusively now.
I'm calling you right now. Hello. We've got several people here that are tuning in, and a couple of wanted to say hi to you. We've got Eddie and Murtis, Melanie McComb, and it looks like another cousin of mine, YAHN37. I'm not sure who that is, but I think that they're related to me somehow.
Well,
but,
hello, everybody. If you have questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Please ask some questions if you've got them. Melanie McComb has some Jewish records overseas, and she's saying that they're hard for her to get as well. And Russia tends to be a fairly cold country, and I would imagine that if some resources were dwindling during some cold winters, that those paper records would look awfully tempting to just transfer into or turn into some warmth, you know. And so
absolutely. And I've seen pictures of those vital records from the Russian Empire. For years, most of these birth registers were like 2.5 feet tall and really wide and 1,000 pages thick, bound together, and they would be put in the damp basement, right?
Oh.
And in the early 1990s, a woman named Miriam Weiner moved to Ukraine and went looking for Jewish vital records registers, being told by the archives, oh, we don't have any of those. But every time she saw a door with a sign in Russian saying, do not enter, she'd go in and she would find shelves upon shelves of these registry books, and she made inventories of them. And
Oh, wow.
And the pictures I've seen, I mean, rats would eat it. There'd be water stains, and of course, whatever got water stained when they used ink with feathers to write stuff, nothing is legible.
Yeah.
So even if they survived, many of them are in poor shape, and others are in good shape. So it's really a potluck when you start to look. And a lot of these records have been indexed on Jewish Gen, and some of the records are in fact linked to digitized copies in archives. That's just starting to happen in the last couple of years. So there's more available out there than I thought 30 years ago when I got started. I assumed that everything had been destroyed during World War II. And that's not true, but there's an element of luck involved.
Sounds like it. Sounds like it. What was one of your most surprising discoveries as you were doing your research?
Oh, goodness. I think the most surprising discoveries have to do with the United States. Finding people mentioned in newspaper articles that I would never have expected. I had a great uncle who was a pharmacist, and his family lived over the shop. And there was a newspaper article during World War II saying that somebody came to the front door of the shop and rattled the door as if trying to break in. And apparently Uncle Sasha went downstairs to the pharmacy, grabbed the gun he kept by the cash register, and shot through the glass window of the shop door and shot the guy. And he claimed, of course, that he was just minding his own business and walking by. I'm sure there must be a court case somewhere, and one day I'm going to get back to Chicago and go look for it.
Some of those court cases that I've been able to get have just been so illuminating as to the character of the ancestors, much more so than just vital records would be. And those court records are just so fantastic. I really enjoy going through them and getting to know my ancestors a bit better.
Well, I was surprised when I was in Chicago in 2008 to find that my Kishinev great-grandmother, who probably didn't speak much English, had sued the city of Chicago for $3,000 because of a hole in the wooden sidewalk that she tripped on and claimed to have injured herself. Now, there has to have been an ambulance chaser who got hold of her, because there's no way she would have thought of this by herself.
I just like hearing like the wooden sidewalk in Chicago.
Exactly. Imagine how much rain and Lake Michigan overflowing routinely each winter, and probably unpaved streets. That's why they would build these wooden sidewalks. So I am not enough of a lawyer to know whether the judgment was in her favor, but I'll be willing to bet she didn't see a penny of that money.
The ambulance chaser got 90% of it.
Exactly. And don't get me started on Aunt Jeanette, who was married at least 4 times, but kind of forgot to get divorced after the first one before she married the second. Oh my
gosh.
Oh yeah, it was a great. So it was like a soap opera.
Oh, that's fantastic.
You know, it was amazing.
So what are some of your favorite books, like genealogy or otherwise? What kind of books do you like recommending people read?
Well, I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I still love my paper books, although I do have a Kindle. One of my favorites for light reading, not light reading, but not specifically for research purposes, is a book called The Family. Okay. By a man named David Laskin. He writes his family story. He too has Jewish roots, and he writes the story of the family that remained behind in Europe, one portion of the family that emigrated to Israel, as happened in my family, and the portion that came to America. And that family, that branch of the family, was the family that started the Maidenform Bra Company in the 1920s. So fascinating stories on all 3 branches, written as if it were a novel. I mean, it's just beautifully written. But from a research point of view, my favorite book is Alexander Bider's Dictionary of Jewish Surnames from the Russian Empire. I use this book with every one of my clients. It's kind of like a gazetteer, but for names. And so
who wrote that?
Alexander Bider, B-E-I-D-E-R. He researched in old newspapers from the Russian Empire and kept a running track of every time a surname was mentioned in the newspaper article. And this has an alphabetical listing of surnames, and then shows which geographic areas of the Russian Empire there are people with that surname.
Wow, what a resource.
It's a fabulous resource, and I use it all the time.
That's impressive. I have like no Russian heritage at all, but I wish that I did, just so I could have that book, that resource. That sounds amazing.
It's phenomenal. And I'm a linguist, so anything to do with words, names, and geography combined. I sometimes just leaf through it at random because it's so fascinating. And I always include a section about the origination of the name. Plus, it helps me if the client doesn't know exactly where his ancestors are from,
sure,
just that it's Russia. This helps me zero in on where I might want to look, or helps confirm if I find a naturalization document as to what part of the Russian Empire the gobbledygook that a Russian town name gets translated into and written in English letters.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So when you do your research, where is like one of your most favorite places to do it? Like just in your office, or do you like going to a library, or taking a plane and flying over to Russia itself?
Well, I haven't been to my ancestral towns. I had hoped to go 2 years ago when I spoke at an international conference in Jerusalem, but the Russians had invaded Crimea at that point, and I thought it was probably not as safe as it ought to have been. So my favorite repository is the Chicago History Museum.
Oh, wow.
They have a marvelous archives upstairs from the museum. And it happens to be the place where the documents for the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union were deposited. And my grandfather was a union organizer for the Amalgamated. And they had something like 14 linear feet of documents. And I think I had enough time, and I spent 6 hours there and got through maybe 2 linear feet worth. But they were gems. I mean, they had a photograph album, not a photograph album. It was a book, a printed book with panoramic pictures, the really wide ones taken of large groups of people. And there was a picture of what appeared to be the union organizers, or the top people in the union, all dressed, in the men in woolen suits, the women in dresses with hats.
Oh, wow.
And a caption saying it was taken in June of 1922. And I knew my grandfather was active in the union at that time. But even with it being a large format, the pictures of each face were the size of a pinky nail.
Yeah.
And I looked with a magnifying glass, and I just could not tell if there was one guy, and I thought, oh, maybe that's my grandfather. And this is in archives, many of which have very strict policies about Xeroxing or getting digital images with your own camera. They did not allow it. They charged money for the privilege of having images made. And it was a choice between having them take a Xerox of the page, which we know would be poor quality,
right,
or paying $40 to have them make a
$40
TIFF image for this picture. And I thought to myself, that's a lot of money. And then I thought, well, wait a moment. If this guy is my grandfather, this will be priceless, because my mother is still alive, 88 years old. And I thought, well, at the time, she was only 80. But I thought to myself, you know what? I have to do this. Because if it is grandpa, I will kick myself. And so I forked over the money and waited for 5 weeks, and the CD arrived, and I went over to my mom's place. I didn't tell her, just in case it was a dud, right?
Yeah.
And so I went to her place, and I put the CD in her computer without telling her. And then I went to the kitchen and said, Mom, could you come take a look at this on your computer? And I had zeroed in on the face I thought was my grandfather and zoomed it. And she came toward the computer and she said, where the hell did you get that picture of my father?
Oh, how cool.
That was like genealogy happy dance, you know? It was fabulous. And then she said, wait a moment, move it over, make it bigger. I knew all of my father's union buddies. Maybe I could recognize someone else. And lo and behold, her father's cousin, Fanny Slavchik, was also in the picture.
Oh, wow.
And we knew she had been a seamstress because she moved to Hollywood in the 30s to work in the movie industry. But I didn't know that she had been a member of the union. And in fact, one of the other things I found at the Chicago History Museum was a minute book of the union meetings, in which workers would file a complaint, and then the union would rule on how to solve the issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Fanny filed a complaint because she had been given a supervisory job, and then it had been taken away and they gave it to a man.
Oh.
And she was complaining, and she wanted to be reinstated because, of course, it also meant more money. But they turned her down. But I had no idea I was going to find anything like that.
That's fantastic. And all of this at the Chicago History Museum.
All at the Chicago History Museum. And what was really amazing to me was my grandfather was on the negotiating committee for the first 8-hour workday contract. In the old days, you know, people worked 10 to 12 hours a day and half a day on Saturday. So all of us who have worked an 8-hour Monday through Friday job, we owe it to the unions. And it turns out that Clarence Darrow may have known my grandfather.
Clarence Darrow, really?
Clarence Darrow was the
Wow.
lawyer for the Amalgamated. And my grandfather had to have known him in the context of negotiating labor contracts for the union. I mean, the Clarence Darrow, Snopes monkey trial. I mean, 1920s history comes to life in a way I would never have expected it.
Is there an archive with like letters that Clarence Darrow wrote? Because maybe it might be a letter to one of your relatives or something like that. That'd be
well.
fascinating.
I had hoped to find something in those labor union documents that would definitely pinpoint Grandpa being actively involved, other than just the family stories I'd been told. All I found was a personal telephone directory. Ma Bell used to give out these little blue and white telephone where you fill out, it was your contact list on your phone today. You would handwrite it in these little giveaways. And I found one that nobody had put their name in as being the owner of it. But on the page for the S's, it said B. Scher and an address in Chicago. And my grandfather was Benjamin Scher. I think that was him. I don't have proof, but I think that was him. So somebody important enough to be included in amongst important corporate papers being donated to this archive knew somebody named B. Scher that I think was Grandpa.
That's pretty cool. So do you have a specific area of interest that you like researching on? And what, if so, what got you interested in that?
Well, because my roots are in the Russian Empire, and because I had started studying Russian when I was in high school, specifically so I could speak to my grandmothers in their native or one of their native tongues, my natural tendency is to work mostly with clients who have a similar background to mine. But in fact, I've worked with people who have deep roots in colonial Virginia and people who have roots in Oklahoma Territory and so forth. Often they hear me speak and they want me to work with them. But my favorite clients are the ones where I get to use my language skills as well as my general genealogy research skills.
And is there something, some area of research that you're working on getting better at, or something that interests you that you want to learn more about, like any other areas of research?
Well, I'm constantly participating in webinars. The most recent ones that I participated in were last week when the National Archives had their genealogy week-long, not the National Archives, I'm sorry, Family Search had its week-long US and Canada seminar that they do every year. So I pretty much went to everything. I don't know very much about Canadian records, so I sat in on quite a few sessions on Canada and learned a lot, and will be able to apply them with the current client I'm working with. So it was very timely.
So you take clients in. You've said that a few times. You take clients in, and you also do a lot of speaking engagements around the country.
Yes, I do. I spoke at Jamboree where we met. Yep. And I'm scheduled to give a talk at the National Genealogical Society in Grand Rapids, Michigan next spring. And at Jamboree again. Excuse me. I love to teach. And so getting a chance to give talks at various venues is good for my soul, and I hope it benefits the people who are attending as well.
I love teaching as well. It's one of the fun aspects of genealogy, is kind of sharing the lessons that you've learned and the information you've gained, and hopefully to make it a little easier on the person who might come into the same problem that I came into, or struggling with a brick wall or something like that.
I couldn't agree with you more. I want to help people not have to learn things the hard way like I did.
And I like it too when that aha moment washes across a person's face. It's something very fulfilling about that too. It's like, oh, you got it, yes, mission accomplished.
I agree, and that's actually why I prefer giving live talks at conferences to giving webinars, because I really miss the feedback. Yes, there's chat boxes and stuff, but I'm too generally involved in what I'm trying to coordinate in terms of the visual and what words go with it, and not getting that feedback from people is distracting to me. I do webinars, but I don't enjoy them as much.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I've had that same experience. For me, it's like a little scary to stand in front of a group of people, but once I get rolling and then I see that people are really getting engaged, and I can ignore like the one or two people that are falling asleep in the back, but concentrate on
that. I recognize that behavior.
But concentrate on the people who are actually paying attention and nodding along, and then every now and then asking some fantastic questions. And so, yeah, I love the speaking part of genealogy, and then the teaching part of it. It's just so fun. It's rewarding, very, very rewarding. And so that's something that you're kind of transitioning into. You were taking clients on part-time, but now you're wanting to move more full-time. We kind of talked about that a little bit before the show.
Yes, I'm also a medical writer for the pharmaceutical industry. And so running two businesses is very wearing. And I'd always thought, well, it's about the time I'm 67, 68, I might consider transitioning into full-time genealogy work. But I just got back from the Association of Professional Genealogists Professional Management Conference, and I'm all revved up and excited and thinking, maybe I'm going to move that timeline forward.
So how could people find you if they wanted to utilize your services?
Well, probably the best way is the old-fashioned telephone, but I don't want to give my phone number over this forum. So the second best way is to find me at SherlockHolmesGenealogy.com. So it's Sherlock, just like Benedict Cumberbatch in the movies, TV series. Combs, like teasing comb, genealogy.com.
And we'll have all those links. We'll have that link inside the description on the Facebook event and here in YouTube, this specific YouTube video as well.
And of course, if they see me and recognize me at SLIG next January, or NGS, or the Genealogy Jamboree, or as happened to me one time, the last time I was in Washington, somebody came up to me on the ferry down to George Washington's estate and said, "Don't you shop at the Ralphs in La Cañada?"
You were on the other side.
I was
of the
in
country?
Washington, D.C., and I live just north of Los Angeles. Lo and behold, yeah, I shop at the Ralphs in La Cañada. I have no idea that I was so memorable to some random person buying Wheaties, but apparently she recognized me. So I love it when people recognize me. Just come up and say hello.
And what convention? Which convention will you be at next?
I'm not speaking. I'm just attending the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy. That's known as SLIG, S-L-I-G, in January.
And that's the end of January. And about 2 weeks later is Roots Tech.
I can't remember. I actually dislike Roots Tech intensely. It's too loud. There's too many people. You're rubbing shoulders trying to get from point A to point B. I went in 2012 and I'll never go back. I mean, I give talks to local genealogy groups, and I've got one scheduled for next week and later in the year. But in terms of the national type of get-togethers, SLIG will be the next one.
I had when I went to Roots Tech, it was pretty busy, but I kind of went. I was invited and I attended almost as a vendor, and I got to see some talks as well. And what was interesting is like people would come to our booth, and so I wouldn't have to necessarily walk around. And so that was a little bit better, I think, experience than maybe what you had, because I'm not great with enclosed spaces and tons of and throngs of people pushing on you. But if I could stay in one place and have them come to me, it's
Yes,
that
I
much
think
better.
that would have been much preferable. I actually gave up after day 2 and just spent the time at the library doing research.
Well,
The only good thing that came out of it was a friend of mine at the last minute couldn't attend a luncheon and gave me her ticket. So I was the second to the last person into the dining hall for this meal and talk there. And so I took that last remaining seat next to a guy. We got to talking, the usual chit chat. And I said to him, well, he looked at my tag and said, oh, you're from California. I said, well, where are you from? He said, oh, I'm from a tiny town in Wyoming. And his tag was facing backwards, right? So he turned it around. And so he says, it's from this little town in Wyoming you wouldn't have heard of. And I said, well, what little town is this? And he says, well, Lyman, Wyoming. Well, my husband was born in Lyman, Wyoming. And so I said, oh my goodness, that's where Dan is from. I remember visiting there and seeing the cabin that his grandfather built in pioneer times. And the guy said to me, well, I live across the street from a cabin from pioneer times. What was the name of his grandfather? And I said, George Leon Rollins. And the guy said, he's my grandfather too, or great grandfather too. It turns out he was Dan's cousin. So again, 1,200 miles away, and randomly sit down next to a second cousin of my husband.
That's pretty random. That's a great story. Well, Jane, this has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and share a little bit about you.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Yeah. Before we go, is there anything else you want to say? Oh, I do have one more question. Is
Yes.
When you first started out as a genealogist, was there anything that you would have wanted to have known, or something, if you could go back in time and tell yourself, hey, concentrate on this, don't drop this? What do you think it would be?
Citations. When I got started, I have a master's degree. I've done research. I know you're supposed to write stuff down, but I would write things down like New York City Directory, 1911, which isn't adequate to either find it again if you need it, or be accurate and complete in keeping track of the resources that you've used. And I've had to redo some of that early work because I didn't make adequate notes as to where I found things.
Got it. I think that's very good advice, and that's one of the most common things that I hear from people, definitely. So on that note, is there anything else you want to say before we take off and sign off here?
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to talk with you today. I really did enjoy it.
Good. I enjoyed it a lot too. Go ahead and I'm going to sign off and say goodbye, but stick around and we can talk after we stop this broadcast.
Absolutely.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching another episode of Faces of NextGen Live. I am Eric Wells, the education coordinator for the NextGen Genealogy Network, and I also have my own company, Legacy Left Right. We will be doing another one of these in about 2 weeks, so stay tuned, or keep an eye out on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook and YouTube, and we'll let you know who we're talking to next and when and where. All right, everybody, we're going to sign off for now. Jane, thanks again, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.